Hey, U.S. History students, hope you're doing well. This is Baker's Backyard again. This is our third lesson of 4 installments that we're trying to pack into our understanding of colonial British America, Unit 2 in the AP U.S. History curriculum. And so we're going to focus our attention today on conflict, rebellion, and warfare, all right? And we're not going to cover every single little issue that happened or detail or whatever, but what we are going to try to do is we're going to try to understand some of the basic nuts and bolts of what started these conflicts and also the results. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of causation today, not just for Unit 2, but also in some ways potentially down the line when you're looking at Unit 3 with coming of the revolution and other things like that. For those of you that like to have objectives to really focus on, we want to understand the conflicts that arose between British settlers and Native Americans through examples. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of examples, some in more detail than others, that give us a pretty solid understanding about, okay, why does this happen and what overall is going to be the effects. Because as we know, Native American relations, whether you're talking about the next time period with the Revolution or even the era of Jackson and other time periods, are very important. Okay. Secondly, we want to be able to analyze the factors that led to various rebellions and the long-term impact. So again, causation. And then thirdly, we want to be able to understand the further development of European competition and rivalry that further developed into the colonial period. Okay. And so we're looking at like some wars that maybe don't stand out quite as much as, of course, the French and Indian War. That'll be the stopping point of this unit and the starting point of the next unit. But we obviously want to understand that this idea of rivalry, competition, whatever word you want to use for it, is very much furthering developing in this time period between not just the British and the French, but also other European countries and powers, of course. The themes for our study today are America and the world. Okay, so the place that America is making as far as, its place, where it is, etc. Work exchange and technology, we'll see that a little bit more related to the development of the slave system further as a result of some of the rebellions and things. And then last two, American and regional identity and culture. All right. And also national, right? Even though it's like, okay, well, are we really a national nation yet? The idea of how we're developing is important. So let's go ahead and get started with our first one, which is the relationship between the native settlers, native population, also the British settlers. Okay. And so before we get into that, just a couple of things to bring your attention. And I know this is not the best diagram, but you can see it, is that we want to be able to understand times, dates, again, context, when we're looking at these different things that go back from rebellion, etc. All right. And so we'll get to that more in a moment. But when we see this picture, students, you can pause the screen if you want, but what do we probably think out the most, when we think of the idea of Pocahontas? We probably think of the connection between the early Jamestown settlers, John Smith. We know that there is going to be some conflict between, the settlers there and also, of course, the Native American population. And of course, Pocahontas is going to become a really important figure with kind of rescuing, if you will, this, really John Smith from probably dying. Okay. And so therefore, that's an important kind of side story. Now, why is this important? The reason being is because it comes down to a certain degree, guys, with differences in land ownership. All right. The question is, if you're a settler and you know that these Native Americans are here first, right, or these American Indians, etc., why do you have conflict here potentially? Well, one of the biggest reasons is it comes back to the idea of, yes, this land is inhabited by them, but it's a matter of perspective about, are these native people basically improving the land? In other words, are they doing things? Are they farming it? Are they doing all these different things? And in the perspective of some people, settlers, in other words, the answer is they are not improving it. Therefore, can you make the connection about what might be a difference between the two sides? And the answer is what? If you're not improving it, you don't basically have, in some people's thinking, guys, the rightful authority to actually continue to own it, use it, etc. Right? And so it comes down to an issue of, okay, if you're not building cities the way that some of these Europeans are looking at it, then there is going to be a conflict of interest with looking at this issue that continues to pop up even into, you know, the 1670s, when we start to talk more in a moment about the issue of Bacon's rebellion. All right, so there is a connection there. So what eventually happens? You're going to have a series of conflicts that basically are important. Land, to a large extent, is going to drive a lot of these people. Think about what we talked about before, okay? If you're one of these British settlers, using Britain as an example here, guys, that has been affected by that enclosure system and, you know, all these different things that limit your ability to have access to land because of social status or whatever it might be, then guess what? You're going to see the need to actually go about getting more control. Now, let's face the facts, as we already know. Some of the previous, or I'm sorry, at the same time, European settlers, like the Dutch and the French, they are going to have some better relationships because of trade. Now, it's not to say, guys, let's make this very clear, that there is not trade between the British and also the American Indians or the native settlers or population, pardon me, when some of the British arrived. There are going to be a lot of opportunities there. So these Native Americans are going to be like, hey, you know, we like, you know, getting this. We like, you know, guns. We like all these different things. And the thing that brings that up is that it's going to have an effect, at least in some ways, on some of the ways that Native Americans think about, you know, how do we farm, right? When they have access to different technology, it's obviously going to affect their culture and lifestyle. Now, remember what we said a couple of weeks ago with the Spanish settlement of the New World, bringing over the horse, and how that's going to affect, obviously, the Plains tribes. It's very similar in that regard. So, guys, make sure that your noggin is constantly at work about connecting things across time periods and also within the same time period. Okay? And so what we notice is that when you're looking at this, these Native American tribes have pressure. We'll see this more with some of the connections that are made in the next unit when we look at the French and Indian War. Okay? And so these native populations are going to have to say, okay, what is in my best interest to actually go out and actually side with the French or the Dutch or the British? Which one of these sides gives us the best opportunity? Okay? And so again, you're going to see some alliances being made. And also, as we'll see here in a moment, you're going to see even some British opportunities to actually establish their own alliances within regions to be able to defend themselves against Native American or American Indian tribes. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind as a basic point. Okay, so a couple of major conflicts that happen that are important, and these are not in any historical order per se: the Pequot War, and also what they called Metacom's War. Okay, now, as you can see, there's going to be a lot of life lost here. We almost always hear about it's disease, disease, disease that brings about a considerable reduction in the Native American or American Indian population. While that is true, warfare is also going to have a tremendous effect. Okay? And the thing to keep in mind is that, again, what are we seeing as a ringing thing? We're seeing the land. Okay? That concept. You know, what can we do with this land that the Native American population is not? Metacom's War, as you can see here, comes about later. Okay? And this is going to be obviously between the English and also some of the Native Americans that are in the New England area. Okay? And the big thing here is, again, you're trying to impose the idea of English culture, law on their societies. And as you can see, you're going to have, you know, Metacom, right? Okay. Different nicknames for him, but Metacom's another one that you come across, probably a more formal name there. And so what we notice, guys, is that again, these Native American tribes or groups, whatever you want to refer to them as, are actually putting up a fight, right? In other words, they're defending their culture, their land, basically their way of life, if you will, against a lot of this infringement from some of these settlers. Makes a lot of sense why. Okay. And then also really quick before we talk briefly about the Powhatan Wars, and that is even in colonies like Pennsylvania that you all heard the stories about with, William Penn having better, attempts to have relations. There is a downside, guys, of this. And the downside is that what happens when a leader like William Penn died? And the answer is that the colony is going to go through, just like any colony would with change in leadership, a change in direction, perhaps. Okay. And so, you're going to notice that there's going to be additional conflict. This walking purchase that you see on your screen that you're welcome to research in more detail if you want to, that's going to be something that really displaces quite a few of the Delaware tribe. Okay. And so, you see a lot of this development of Delaware. Delaware, as you all know, if you've seen, geography of that state, which most of you have, I'm sure all of you have in some way, it's small. It's only a few counties in size. Okay. But this purchase is going to make it to where these Native American groups are less likely to hold on to their native lands. Okay. I want you all to pause for a second and think about, guys, what are we seeing particularly in this particular map? And you'll see a lot of different tribes that appear in other places, like Shawnee will be in Ohio, where I grew up, Southern Ohio. Delaware, as you can see, is going to be, of course, in different areas, right? So the point is that you're going to start to see Iroquois in the northern part, guys, because of their association with, New York, etc. Okay, they're going to be extremely important. And so when you see all this different population moving into, a colony like Pennsylvania, which, keep in mind, was very diverse. You see the Scots-Irish, German population, etc., etc. Okay, you're going to see a lot of these groups, again, going for that idea of land. Okay. Now, I forgot to show you one thing, so I apologize. So I'll go back to it. But with these Anglo-Powhatan Wars, okay, they're called wars for a reason. These don't just happen in 1 year and they're done. You're going to have one, I think it was around the 1620s, and then you're going to have another one that pops up in the 1640s. Okay. Now you might be thinking, okay, Mr. Baker, we know that there was conflict with the settlers over land. You've already said that. Well, what's going to be one of the bigger outcomes of the Second Powhatan War, as it was known as, which was around 1644? Okay. Well, one of the bigger outcomes, guys, is going to be that the British are pretty much, the English, pardon me, are going to pretty much push these people further westward. Okay. And so you might be thinking, man, that sounds a little bit familiar, right? I'm thinking maybe about even something like the Trail of Tears. Okay. And those are things that are going to happen, right? So what happens is that you could argue that they're already being told, this is your land. And guess what? It's almost like you could say an earlier form of reservation living. Okay. It just so happens too that later on, according to a lot of historians, the Powhatan tribe, if you will, or group, are going to basically die out. Again, partly due to disease and also partly due to, of course, the warfare. Okay. So that's kind of our first part here with the relations with the colonists and the native population, some of the wars and conflicts that arose. Now, the question is, when we look at rebellion, conflict as well, so maybe a different kind. The question is, guys, when we think of rebellion, what do we usually think of? We think of people that oppose a policy. They disagree with the norm of society, whatever it might be. They disagree. Well, what I want to challenge you to think about, guys, with our brief discussion on rebellions, we're going to look at 3 of them in some detail. We're going to look at probably the most well-known one, which is Bacon's Rebellion. We're going to look at the Leisler's Rebellion in New York. We're also going to look at the famous Stono Rebellion that's more related to slavery and the development of that system. Okay, so I want to challenge your thinking with our discussion here about this. What is going to be factors, reasons that cause these outcomes, the reasons for these rebellions, these people saying, you know what, no, we think that society needs to be changed, okay? And the deal is, guys, as a lot of you already know, is that when we're looking at the establishment of colonial Virginia, and then, of course, Maryland and other parts, we're seeing labor systems, you know, especially ones that relate to the idea of indentured servitude, headright system, and also eventually slavery developing. Okay, so you can pause if you need to, but by the 1660s and 70s, which is the dawn of Bacon's Rebellion. So again, context here. Okay, these people have fulfilled their duties. They've been here for 5 or 7 years. They've paid off, you know, the amount of money that they needed to in order to be able to have a degree of freedom. Okay, there's something to be said that if you really own land, guys, that is one of the biggest signs of freedom that you can have. Okay, the problem is that many of these settlers are poor, they're in poverty, they don't have the land that they want. In many cases, they might be still using or working the land of others. And so what's going to happen? Guys, check this out. Again, this is where there's a connection to our previous discussion. The idea of wanting the land of the native population. Now, Jamestown, at this point in time, okay, has already become a royal colony. You could argue part of that was a result of the First Powhatan War. Okay, in 1624 is when they became a royal colony, by the way, amongst other things. You know, the Virginia Company was failing as a joint stock company, that kind of thing. Okay, but the problem here, guys, is that, again, these natives have moved. The government in Jamestown has been somewhat supportive of Native American lands. Okay, and so what happens? You've got a governor, Berkeley. And Berkeley is going to be like, okay, yes, I hear you. I hear your voices, white settlers. You want land. All right. Berkeley, his argument is, okay, you know, everybody wants land, but the argument on the part of the settlers that are eventually going to riot and rebel is, guess what? You are not supporting the landless poor. You're supporting who? The wealthy plantation owners. In other words, this upper class of people, you know, some people would use the word aristocrat there, right? That obviously own the land. That also means that, you know, as time moves on, especially then as well, that they have slave populations. Okay. One thing you have to keep in mind, guys, is that Native Americans and their relationship with the British, you see, you know, that use of like the encomienda system with like Spanish settlement that we talked about. You don't see that, you don't see that highly used in British North America as far as the American, you know, colonies and states that we associate with the current continental United States. Okay. You do see a degree of that, you know, in parts of the Caribbean, all right, especially with Spain, but not as much the British. Okay. So what's the cause then? A lot of you are going to say, well, Mr. Baker, it's money. Okay. It's land. I get it. But what do both of those things connect to? If you put 2 and 2 together, you've got a landless poor and you've got a wealthy elite that are landowners and plantation owners. That basically alludes to one other thing that we'll look at in our next session, guys, and that is the development of class warfare. Okay. Now, in the case of Bacon's Rebellion, does it get violent? Yep. Bacon takes it upon himself to obviously lead this rebellion. They burn the city or town of Jamestown. Okay. Berkeley, as you can see, is obviously going to not be in the best situation as a result of this. Okay. And obviously, Jamestown is going to be taken by the rebels, all right, or those involved in the rebellion. Okay. Now, it's interesting because some sources, guys, will tell you that Bacon was not, in fact, a poverty-stricken settler. Okay. Now, I don't know if I would go as far to say that Bacon was, a wealthy aristocrat, but probably by today's standards, many people would argue that he was probably at least a middle-class person. You don't see that used as much back then, but now, of course, we certainly hear about that. Okay. And so, as you can see here, Berkeley is eventually going to regain power. Now, the question is, so what? We know what happened. We know the reasoning behind it. What's going to be the ultimate outcome? Well, first of all, continued conflict between, of course, the settlers and also the native population. Okay? You have this division or divide in social class, like I just said. Okay? So, again, that's clear. That's not going to go away. I mean, we still have social class division. This is not a political statement, guys, but the observation is we still have that to an extent in our modern American society. Okay? So, this is big. But here's another thing. A lot of you might be like, okay, Mr. Baker, if these indentured servants, have become, less reliant as far as a labor source for people that own land, right? They want to own their own land, in other words, you could say. Then what's going to happen? Well, take a look at the last point here. Charles II. Now, this is actually before Bacon's rebellion, but it gives you a perspective on what is kind of transpiring before and also after. He's going to basically charter the Royal African Company to carry what? More enslaved Africans to North America. Okay. And so pause your screen and ask yourself the question. Now, guys, keep in mind, indentured servitude was not just in Virginia. You see a lot of movement between there and Maryland as well. Some in North Carolina. South Carolina was, a bit different than North Carolina, but the Carolinas develop as one big area before they, of course, separate, keep in mind. Okay. And so what do we notice about, in this case, Maryland? Okay. Even, between the 1670s, okay, we're seeing kind of like a little bit of a up and down, up and down. And then as we move into the earlier 1700s, which is 18th century, keep in mind, we're seeing, I think it's safe to say, guys, a pretty dramatic increase in slave labor. And we're seeing the exact opposite with indentured servitude. What effect does that have? Check it out. So this chart is a really good chart. Tells you a little bit about the economy. Tells you a little bit about the labor force. A lot of you are probably not going to be real surprised by this, but just for the sake of giving you a little bit more food for thought. Chesapeake in North Carolina. Keep in mind, Chesapeake includes Virginia and Maryland. Okay. Tobacco, smaller plantations. Okay. Substantial master to slave contact. All right. Now, a lot of you guys might already know that, yes, slavery, you are going to see that in northern colonies as well. All right. Now, keep in mind, down the line, the northern states, later on, are going to be more likely and are more likely to start that process of what we call emancipation. But as I said to you all in class the other day, that you are going to see even in northern colonies laws, and we'll talk more about this in a second, guys, with the slave rebellion. You are going to see more laws in northern colonies that even protect, the rights of slaves to marry. Whereas the harsher slave codes or laws or whatever word you want to use for them in southern colonies are going to really restrict that a lot more. Okay. Something to consider. I'm not going to read all this to you. You can look at it, But again, South Carolina, Georgia, larger plantations, intensive slave labor. Okay, now remember what I told you all in class the other day. South Carolina, only a third of the white population that was there, okay, owned slaves. 2/3 of them did not. But what's going to happen by the end of the 1700s, early 1800s? All right, I'm sorry, 1600s, early 1700s. You are going to see about 61% of South Carolina's population that is of African descent. Middle colonies, large-scale farms, family farms, urban trade and commerce. Now, middle colonies were kind of like the best of both worlds in this respect. That's no disrespect to the southern colonies and the northern colonies. But guys, think about geography. All right? They're going to be able to grow wheat more. They're going to be able to grow things. Their ports are obviously pretty solid too, compared to, Boston, places like Charleston, etc. Okay? So therefore, you're not going to see slavery developing quite as much. That's a trend that you want to think about, guys, as you compare and contrast things like geography, social development, economic development, etc. All three of those things are connected. All right, even within the government, who's going to control most of the southern government to a large extent? It's going to be a lot of these people with land, plantations, aristocracy. Okay, you're going to see that in the northern middle colonies, wealth is much more evenly distributed between the people. Think about why that's important. Okay, so another rebellion that you come across that we'll spend just a few minutes on is the famous Leisler's Rebellion. Okay, now if you don't know much about Leisler, he was, I believe, was a Calvinist. Okay, keep in mind, New York was originally settled by the Dutch. The British, or the English, pardon me, take control over it. Okay, Leisler has some differences. You can make a really strong argument that this is a class revolt. Okay, people having differences on taxation. Okay, land ownership again. Okay, this rebellion is eventually overthrown. As you can see, Leisler was executed. Okay, and you might be wondering, what about William and Mary? Right, a lot of you guys are familiar with that changeover from the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution, etc. Okay, so you're going to notice again that you see some transition with the direction of the British government. But at the end of the day, take a look at what it says: appointed a governor that opposed Leisler. What does that indicate? Their governor is appointed by the crown. Okay, so we're talking here, guys, about that royal colony status. But the issues, just because we have a rebellion because of class differences, again, similar to what we saw with just a moment ago with Bacon, is not going to go away just because people are not real happy about it. Okay. And then lastly, with our rebellions, before we wrap up, just a few moments on European additional conflict in warfare, is the issue of slave rebellion. Now, probably the most well-known slave rebellion that is not on this slide, but you'll see it on the next slide, during this time period is going to be what we call the Stono Rebellion, S-T-O-N-O. Now, think about what we've already said. All right, by this time, we're moving forward. We, as in the southern colonies especially, with a very strong reliance on slave labor. Okay, and so you've already got slavery in parts of the Caribbean, Barbados. A lot of you guys are familiar with the idea that you see a very large trade coming from there into places like Charleston. What's going to happen? Many of these colonies, South Carolina, Virginia, etc., are going to start to pass these acts. Now, keep in mind, a little bit of review. What is the House of Burgesses? It's that version of the legislature of Virginia that has the ability to create policy and law. Okay? And so as you can see here, guys, 1660, I mean, this is, what is it, about 53 years after the settlement of Jamestown. So, what is that? A little bit more than half a century. They are already making it legal that black laborers can be enslaved. Okay. 1662, slavery was defined as inherited. So if you to have a child, okay, obviously, according to that, your children would actually be enslaved. Okay. You all probably have heard the stories about the slave auctions and or sales and things like that at different places. If you ever go to Charleston, South Carolina, you can visit, those areas that used to be, of course. Okay. Very important to keep in mind. 1695, a formal slave code was adopted. Okay. So you're seeing over time, keep in mind, both 1660 and 1662, that's prior to Bacon's Rebellion. 1695 is, of course, afterwards. Very important. Okay. So you can pause here if you want to. Okay. So a lot of pictures, a lot of engravings, things along those lines. You can obviously kind of draw some conclusions on if you want to. Okay. And then, of course, later on, we know that with the invention of the cotton gin, that's going to make slavery even become more profitable, as some people would say. Okay. And then what happens? Slave laws, legalizing different, I guess, variations of slavery, if you will. Okay. And then what happens? Resistance. Now, the one thing, guys, I think is important, it's not on the slide here, is this. A lot of times when we think of, okay, slavery came from Africa, we think, okay, one culture. Guys, you got to remember, there's not just going to be one area of Africa. I mean, we think of the West Coast or the slave coast or Ivory Coast, but you got to remember there's a lot of different places that these people are coming from. Okay. So therefore, they're going to bring with them some different, perhaps belief systems. That could be religion, customs, languages, okay, things like that. And so it's very important for us to understand that those people bring very distinct cultures with them. Okay. So one way of trying to kind of oppose the system, which makes a lot of sense, is trying to kind of hold on to those things, even if, you're discouraged to kind of do something different. Okay. And so some kind of interesting ways of doing it that are more nonviolent, broken tools. Now, burning down buildings becomes, more along those lines that you see. And so the question is, okay, what is this Stono Rebellion? It's about 100 people. Slaves rebelled. Okay. Read a story a while ago that some of them were actually trying to go as far south as Florida. Why would they want to do that? Keep in mind, Britain does not own Florida. Spain does. All right. So part of the argument is, if you can get beyond the Carolinas and eventually Georgia, which 1733 is when that was formally settled, guys, keep in mind, or established as a colony, pardon me, then maybe you have a bit more opportunity to be able to have that freedom that you so desire. Okay. And so the Stono Rebellion, on their way, they're going to be burning homes and buildings and things like that. Eventually, the rebellion, of course, is put down. It starts off, I believe, was in South Carolina. And basically, what's the big thing that comes up? We want to make sure that rebellion is not a common practice moving forward. Okay. So what do you all think is going to happen to those slave codes or laws? They're going to become more harsh, you could say. They're going to become more regulatory. Down the line, I think I shared this story with class the other day, but just to reiterate, I mean, the 1800s, you see like similar kinds of things with Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey. What do a lot of these states do? Then states, not colonies any longer. Keep in mind, you've got a lot of new states like Mississippi, et cetera, by then. They're going to be passing a lot of these codes that are very restrictive. You know, you can't even teach your slaves to read and write and do basic math in some cases. Reasoning is pretty simple. Knowledge is power. You have the ability to read documents that allude to freedoms and rights. What's going to happen? You're going to think, hey, we need to basically advocate for that too. Okay? So something to keep in mind. So with that being said, where does this lead us, guys, into the development of British colonial America, leading us toward really the end of this time period, at least parts of it? And the answer is, guys, is basically further conflict with not just the native population, but that will certainly continue, but also other European nations. Okay? And so what we notice is that we see a transition, right? You have this glorious revolution. You know, Cromwell, of course, his civil war is going to end. Cromwell, guys, by the way, I didn't point this out to you, was pretty adamant about furthering colonization, right? I don't know if I would put him as a close second or whatever to Queen Elizabeth or whatever, but definitely you see that under his time in office or as ruler. Okay, so conflict. What's happening? Conflict over religion. Some people want to remain Catholic. The official church now is Church of England or Anglican Church, which, keep in mind, a lot of people in the southern colonies identified themselves with the Church of England. Okay, North Carolinians, not to the same extent as you would find in parts of Virginia and South Carolina and even parts of Georgia, but something to keep in mind. Okay, so what happens? You see the development of this Dominion of New England. What are they trying to do? They're trying to basically assert a stronger degree of British authority over the colonies. Now, our last session, we talked about how they tried to do that through mercantilism, things like navigation acts. Now, as you can see here, guys, they're doing this in a little bit more of a political and economic way. Banning town meetings. Why? When people group together, they're likely to talk about things that they might not like, and they're also likely to basically try to do something about it. Okay. Imposing new taxes. Now, eventually, we've all heard Stamp Act, you know, the Townsend Acts that come up in our next unit, but this is already taking place. And then, of course, challenge land titles. Do you have a right to that? Again, remember what I said, guys, a lot of people associate freedom, the ultimate concept of freedom to an extent with some people was that concept of land ownership. Okay? So we have a couple of wars that happen. Williams. Okay? So this develops quite importantly, right? When we're looking at these important ideas. Okay? So we're not going to say a lot about that, but again, we're continuing to see, guys, these conflicts that are leading up to a lot of problems. Then we have wars that deal with European countries. The Native Americans, like I said earlier in our discussion, guys, they have to make decisions. Who do they side with? Who is the best ally? I mean, if you don't side, you know, they already see the handwriting on the wall. They're losing some of their land. So which European power is going to give you the best opportunity to hold on to a degree of land and also autonomy to an extent? Something to keep in mind. Okay? So you notice this, guys. You see the fur trade continuing. Iroquois League of Five Nations, political and military and alliance of Native American tribes. Eventually, I believe it was 6, but anyway, probably the most common tribe you hear about is the Mohawk, etc. Okay, but those are all things that are happening. Their trade will be definitely interfered with as a result of these European rivalries. No question. Okay. Queen Anne's War, again, another conflict to keep in mind. Okay. Now, I want to throw an idea out at you all, which is we've all heard of world wars, World War I, World War II. We think of, in the case of World War I, I think it was like 29 countries or something along those lines that fought this massive large scale war. 8 to 10 million people died. World War II, much more expansive. Okay. And we think, okay, world wars are just unique to the 20th century. The thing I want to challenge your thinking with, guys, in this video with these conflicts, you can make on a smaller scale, yes, an argument that these conflicts do in fact allude to and even confirm the presence of a degree of world fighting, or definitely fighting within the European continent. Okay. And so when you say here, guys, okay, the Treaty of Utrecht, which is designed to end the war, that's what treaties usually do. Okay. But it says it aimed to balance the interests of European powers and their colonial possessions. My question to all of you is, what do you think they mean by that? Because we've been talking about a little bit that when you see the rise of colonialism or colonization, whatever you want to call it, when you see the rise of mercantilism, etc., guys, yeah, you might say, well, Mr. Baker, you've beat, the idea of competition like a dead horse. Okay, what else is new? I like to do that. But at the end of the day, guys, what are these European powers really trying to do? Well, think about it. Hold on to possessions that give them a lot of opportunity to have economic power, which a lot of people associate with political power, which also people also associate with military power. And so if you lose something, I mean, guys, think about what happened to Spain, 1588, they lost their armada. Now you ask, well, Mr. Baker, there's still colonial power technically until the later 1800s. Okay, true. But you can make a strong argument that with the loss of that armada, you're going to see a very big change in that balance of power with European nations. Okay, so as we approach the end of this time period, guys, in the early part of the next one, think about that, right? How is that divide, if you will, going to affect Britain and France fighting a war? France eventually coming in on the side of the United States to fight a war that we call a war of independence. Spain did the same thing, if you didn't know that. Very interesting. All right, King George's War. Last major thing to consider here, guys. England versus Spain. Now, keep in mind, this is well after the famous Armada that happened, all right, or the sinking of it, okay? And so some people call this the War of Jenkins' Ear. You can see why, with the person losing his ear. Kind of an interesting story if you want to read that on your own, okay? And so you're seeing, guys, again, this is, by the way, by the time that Georgia has been settled. So that buffer zone between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. So if you look at St. Augustine, a possession of Spain and Spanish Florida, pretty important. By the way, this is only 6 years before the famous French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. Okay. I want to remind you all, for those of you in my class, first of all, I hope you had a great session. We'll go into more detail about that if you can attend the class session. But I want to make sure, guys, you've read chapter 3, which is the last chapter on colonization. This chapter deals a little bit more with 18th century settlement. So we get a little bit more into the development of things like social classes and rights and the politics and all these different cool things that go a step further beyond just the history of the colonies and their settlements. We want to review thinking skills in your fabric text. Please see your module for that. We're going to start to look, guys, a little bit more in depth this week at writing short answer questions and also start the process of long essays. We're going to do long essays in the course of a 2-week time, and then you're going to write your full length one between week 4 and week 5. Okay, so I'm going to be posting videos on how to do that, so please make sure that you're using that if you can. Okay, we also want to make sure that we're moving forward with applying our document analysis skills. Okay, think about, guys, how you're building upon those each week with how to add knowledge that you're reading, how to add, obviously, you know, the context and point of view and all those different things that usually apply. And then also remember outside information. Okay. Outside information should not be, I need to Google something to be able to know something about drawing a conclusion on a document. Okay. So use the resources that I or your teacher provide you, and you should be good to go there. Unless your teacher says to specifically research it online, then of course you want to follow their insight there. And then fourthly, you want to make sure that you're showing additional understanding of concepts through your multiple choice quizzes. Now remember, this week, 5 questions still, 1 based on historian arguments, 2 will be based off of the, what is it? Oh yeah, 2 of them will be based off of the documents that are excerpts, passages, whatever. And then 2 of those will be based off of things like, you know, visuals, charts, maps, graphs, things like that. Okay. As always, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Email me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. Otherwise, I hope you have a great one. I look forward to see you during lesson 4, which will be kind of our conclusion on colonial settlement and a really good segue into the revolution in this time period. Thank you guys. Have a good one. Stay safe. Bye-bye.